I'm so
Yeah,
curious.
sure.
Welcome to the 11, boys.
I'm excited for this
Let's
conversation
go.
because I consider you to be really intelligent. But I feel like sometimes there are ways that conservatives talk about certain issues that seem to defy logic and reason, I guess. So here, I'm not sure you feel the same way about progressives. Well, I feel the same way about progressives, but even some liberals for sure. Before I ask this question, it's going to relate to education. We can agree, broadly speaking, that statistics are real and that not everybody could do everything. So for a grounded example, my life was pretty bad. I got into streaming and I turned my life around, and that was really cool, but I can't expect everybody to do what I did, right? Like everybody being able to join the NBA or to be like a streamer.
Of course, everybody has different qualities. Sure.
Okay. So I used to be a lot more libertarian when I was 2021, and one of the things that dramatically changed kind of my view on government manipulation of things in the, I guess, in society came when it came time to deal with my son and the school that he went to. And one of the things that I noticed was when it came time to send my son to school, I could either do private education or I could do public. Personally, I did 12 years of Catholic private education. However, the public schools in Nebraska, depending on where you live, very, very, very good. And I opted for a certain district. I bought a house there. I moved there. And my son was able to go to those schools. And he's been going through those schools. And the difference of availability of like technology, like these kids are taking home iPads in like first grade. They've got like huge computer labs and everything. Do you think that there is some type of, I don't want to say injustice or unfairness, but I'm not even looking at it that way, just pragmatically, that there might be children that are in certain schools that if they just had better funding or more access to technologies or things available to them, that those kids would become more productive members of society. That would like a little bit of how they could actually achieve more and do better for all of society.
So I think that on the list of priorities when it comes to education, the availability of technology is actually fairly low on the list of priorities.
Sure. The things I've heard are food availability and I think air conditioning. I think are the two biggest ones that I heard. But sure.
Well, I mean, the biggest thing in terms of education itself, not just the physical facilities that we're talking about, would actually be two-parent family households. Sure. Communities that have fathers in them is actually the number one decisive according to Roland Fryer and many studies on this particular topic. And the idea that money alone, that investment of resources, is the top priority in schooling is belied by the fact that LAUSD, which is where I went to school when I was younger, they pour an enormous amount of money into LAUSD. We're talking about tens of thousands of dollars very often per student, and does not result in better schooling outcomes. And so when you say, if we could give every kid an iPad, would you give every kid an iPad? The question is not, if I had a replicator machine from Star Trek, would I give everybody the metronome sound? So sure, I would. But every resource is finite, every resource is limited, and you have to prioritize what are the outcomes that you seek in terms of the means with which you are seeking them. And so, again, I think that the question is I quibble with the premise of the question, which is that, again, the chief injustice when it comes to education on the list of injustices is lack of availability to technology or that it's a funding problem. I just don't think that's the case.
Sure, and I can half agree with you there, but I don't think any amount of changes in the schools will create two-parent households. Right, we can't bring in...
I totally agree with you. So I think that the fundamental educational problem is not, in fact, a schooling problem. I think that it pre-exists that.
Sure, but then I feel like this is kind of the conservative merry-go-round where it's like, what can we do to help the schools? So two of the things that I've seen, I think, that are usually brought up in research is one is air conditioning, that children in hotter environments just don't learn as well. And then the second one is access to food. So like kids that are given like a breakfast or a lunch that's provided at school, like increases educational outcomes. Now I agree that neither of these things might be determinative in like, well, 20% of kids are graduating, now 80% of kids are graduating, or these kids are all going, you know, from with their GEDs into the workforce, and now these kids are all suddenly becoming engineers. But in terms of where we can help, do you think there should be like some minimum threshold or minimum baseline of like, at the very least, every school should have a non-leaky gym, or every school should have, if children can't afford lunch or breakfast, like some sort of food provider, or every school should have these like baseline things.
So again, I'm going to quibble with the premise of the question, because I think when it comes to, for example, food insecurity, school food programs, again, you can always pour money into any program and at the margins create change. I mean, there's no doubt that pouring money onto anything will create change in a marginal way. The question is, how large is the margin and how big is the movement? Right. So the delta is what I'm looking at. And so I think that you're starting at a second order question, which is, what if we ignore what I would think are the big primary questions of education, namely family structure, value of education at home, how much you have parents who are capable or willing to help with homework, what are the incentive structures we can set up for society that actually facilitate that, how local communities parents take ownership of their schools is a big one, right? All of these issues we're ignoring in favor of, say, air conditioning or lunch programs. And so in a vacuum, if you say air conditioning and lunch program, sounds great in a vacuum. In terms of prioritization of values and cost structure, are those the things that I think will move the needle in a major way in terms of public policy? I do not. And in fact, I think that many of them end up being disproportionate wastes of money. I mean, I've talked before, pretty controversially, about the fact that an enormous amount of school lunch programs are thrown out. An enormous amount of that food ends up in the garbage can. Is there a better way to do that? If there is a better way to do it, then I'm perfectly willing to hear about that better way to do it. But it seems to me that one of the big flaws in the way that many people of the left approach government is, what if we hit every nail with a hammer? And my question is, what if the gnat isn't even the problem? What if there's a much bigger substructure problem that needs to be solved in order to, if you're shifting deck chairs on the Titanic, sure, you can make the Titanic slightly more balanced because the deck chairs are slightly better oriented. But the real question is the water that's gaping into the Titanic, right?
Yeah, and I agree with you 100%. But again, I feel like we're on the conservative merry-go-round then of never wanting to address as a conservative merry-go-round.
I can give you 10 ways.
Well, sure, but so like here would be the merry-go-round. I would say that like there's a minimum funding for school.
I need to tell you,
children, and then we go, well, the thing that helps the most is two-parent households. And I go, okay, well, two-parent households actually aren't the problem. The issue is access to things like birth control because they don't have children early on. And it's like, but the issue isn't actually birth control. The issue is actually you need a certain amount of money to move out early and to get married and then to have a two-parent household. So it's actually like economic opportunity. No, well,
You know, just two-parent household.
yeah, but like, what are the precursors?
People before you're married have babies. Sure, done.
That's great. We can say that and try to fight against, however many hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution. But people will have sex and people will have babies.
And then they used to get married. The vast majority of people in this country with kids used to be married. The vast majority of people with kids in this country now are not married increasingly. That is obviously a societal change. Some of them changed. It wasn't human evolution.
But a lot of those things in terms of resting on whether or not people get married have to do with financial decisions. Do you have the money?
Well, worse off now than they were 50, 60 years ago when the marriage rates were higher.
People are delaying the start of a career because education is increasingly important.
So, in other words, people are richer now and they have more education now, and yet they're having more babies out of wedlock now because they're richer and have more education.
I'm saying that one of the biggest indicators for whether or not somebody's going to get married is how much money will people earning if they can move out of their household. People don't tend to want to get married at 22 when they've just finished college, when they don't have the money to move out, and they can't afford a house.
Because we have changed the moral status of marriage in the culture, meaning that everyone, poor, rich, and in between, used to get married. That is, by the way, a huge percentage of marriages in the United States used to be what they call shotgun marriages, meaning that somebody knocked somebody up, and because they did not want the baby to be born outside of a two-parent household, they would then get married.
Do we think that shotgun marriages, though, are a way to bring back equilibrium to education?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, 100%. Do we think that there's a mother and a father? Sure. That is the basis for all of this, including education.
Do we think that shotgun marriages are, well, let's say this, do we think that that's a reasonable direction that society will ever take? Or is this like
It was the reasonable direction for nearly all of modern history.
was, but history moves in one direction, right? Because of time?
I mean, I think people think that this, in what ways?
And I don't think we've, regressed social standards back to like, oh, well, let's go 100 years back and do things that, used to exist before. I think
The entire left right now is arguing that we regress social standards by rejecting Roe versus Wade, so that's obviously not true.
The Roe versus Wade is not a social standard, it's a Supreme Court rule. That's
Yes.
one. Number two, what if you read the actual majority of opinion on Roe v. Wade, because socially we actually never made huge progress on how society views abortion. This has always been an incredibly divisive thing, right? Even that was, I think, part of Alito's writing on it was that things like gay marriage, for instance, we've kind of moved past, and it's not really as debated anymore. But abortion was never a settled topic. Despite Roe v. Wade,
The arc of history constantly moves in one direction and belied by nearly all of the 20th century.
what do we mean by that?
I mean, never have women's rights, civil rights, barbarism, communism, Nazism, all of that was a regression from what was happening at, for example, the beginning of the 19th century and the 20th century.
In what way?
Nazism and communism were a regression from what was happening in 1905.
These are, well, in terms of like communism being a regression, for instance, I'm not a communist, but like the industrialization of the Soviet Union happened under a communist society. The industrialization of there's
There's a regression. Moral regression, which is what we are talking about now, moral regression. And you're suggesting that moral regression, I wouldn't term a return to traditional values in moral regression, you would. But your suggestion is that history only moves in one direction, and I'm suggesting that history does not only move in one direction, it tends to move actually back and forth.
Sure. I don't think that all of history moves in one direction. There are going to be wars, there are going to be times of peace. I think in general we're more peaceful successful now than we have been in the past.
Well,
I
just
think when we
change
look at
his
the way that
stance
people
there.
live their lives, I think that we tend to move in a certain direction socially. So when it comes to things like racism, or when it comes to things like slavery or women's rights, I think that there are two huge things that probably aren't changing in the U.S. And one is access to contraception, and one is women working jobs. I think that these two things are probably huge things that are moving us off of shotgun marriages or getting married very early on. And I don't see those. Do you think that those two things are going to change fundamentally?
First of all, what the data tend to show is that actually more highly educated people, as you were saying, tend to get married more. So the idea is that women getting an education somehow throws the law of marriage. It's the opposite. Usually those women are not educated.
But those women aren't getting shotgun marriages. Those women aren't having children.
Yeah, but now you're shifting the topic. My topic was how to get more people married. And what I would suggest, and then you suggested that higher levels of education are delaying marriage and making it less probable. And what I'm telling you, because this is what the data suggests, is that actually as you raise up the educational ladder, people tend to be married more than they are lower down on the educational ladder. If you're a high school graduate, you're less likely to be married than if you're a postdoc.
I agree with you, but that's because one of the biggest precursors to getting married is having like a level of economic stability. So if people get more educated, they obtain this economic stability, and then they're in a more comfortable position to explore more serious
There's
relationships.
another confound there. I mean, the confound is that people in stable marriages tend to be the children of stable marriages, and there's only one way to break that cycle, which is to create a stable marriage, and that is something that is in everyone's hands. Again, this notion that it is somehow an unbreakable, unshatterable barrier to get married and have kids, I don't understand where this is coming from. Why is that such a challenge?
I don't think it's unbreakable or unshatterable. The initial point was for school, if we could provide a minimum level of educational stuff for children, that's probably good. But when we retreat back to, well, it has to be the families that are fixed first, fixing families is a multivariate problem.
So in my mind, in my local community, we all vote. Again, I've suggested that there's a difference between local community and federal. I'm fine with my local community voting for school lunches or air conditioning or whatever it is that we all agree to do, because the more local you get, the more homogeneity you get in terms of interest, and the more interest you have in your neighbors. All of that's fine. I'm part of a very, very solid community. In our community, we give to each other. We have minimum standards of helping one another. All that's wonderful. When it comes to the actual problem of education, what I object to in the political sphere, and this happens all the time, is everybody is arguing on top of the iceberg about how we can move the needle 0.5 percentage points, as opposed to the entire iceberg melting beneath them, and we just ignore that. We pretend that that's just, sort of the natural consequence of thing. The arc of history suggests that people are never going to get married again. Yeah, well, I mean, actually, the arc of history suggests, realistically speaking, is that the people who are not getting married are not going to be having kids. And what it also suggests, the people who are married are going to be having kids. And so the demographic profile, actually, over time, is rather going to shift toward people who are having lots and lots of kids. I'm married. I have 4 kids. Everyone in my community is married. That's like minimum buy-in in my community is 4 kids. Okay, and so what's happening, actually, in terms of demographics, is that people who are more religious and getting married are having more kids. And so if you're talking about the arc of history shifting toward marriage, I would suggest that actually demographically, over time, long periods of time, not for one generation, over long periods of time, the only cure for low birth rate is going to be the people who get married and have lots of kids.
Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree with any of that, but I'm just saying that, again, on Europe, so whenever I get the term married around, I think that there are good conversations to be had about people getting married, because stable families produce stable children that are less likely to commit crime, that are more likely to go to school, they're more likely to be productive in society. So I'm not going to disagree with any of that. All that's true. It's just frustrating that sometimes when you bring up any problem, all of it will circle back to other things that makes it seem like we can't make any progress in any area without like fixing
Well,
something.
way, I mean, I literally just talked about it on the local level. I'm fine with people voting for air
Yeah, but
conditioning.
so for instance, on the local level, so for school funding is done and generally per district. So what do you do when you have poor districts that can't afford air conditioning for their school?
I mean, the idea there would be that presumably if the society in the state, and I generally don't mean the federal state, I mean like the state of California, for example, decides that everybody ought to have air conditioning, people will vote for air conditioning, and that's perfectly legal. And I don't think there's anything morally objectionable about that, per se. Cool. I also don't think that that's going to heal anything remotely like the central problem. And I think that what tends to happen in terms of government is people love arguing about the problems that can be solved by opening a wallet, and nobody likes to solve a problem by, closing their sex life to one person, for example, or having kids within a stable religious community. Like, the things that actually build society. I'm fine with arguing about each of these policies, and whether we apply them or not is a matter generally of pragmatism, not morality. It's a matter of incentive structures, not per se morality. Because incentive structures do have moral underpinnings. There's such a thing as, for example, if you're using a welfare program, you have to decide how effective it is, to what crowd it applies, where the cutoffs are, does it disincentivize work, does it not disincentivize. All of these are pragmatic concerns. But on a moral level, the generalized objection that I have to people on the left side of the aisle is that they like to focus. In these conversations, very often it feels as though it's a conversation with people who are drunk searching under the lamp for their keys. The problems they want to look at are the problems that are solvable by government. And then all the problems they don't want to look at, which are the actual giant monsters lurking in the dark, and not particularly solvable by government, are the ones they want to ignore and assume are just the natural state of things. And I don't think that's correct at all.
And I 1,000,000,000% agree. And then obviously my criticism of the conservative side is the exact opposite, where there are parts where government could remedy some issues. For instance, children having sex with each other, producing other children out of wedlock. Like sometimes having after-school programs is nice to prevent that. Like I didn't have time for these things when I was in school. I was doing football practice. I was doing cross-country practice. I went in early for a band. I agree with you that sometimes people only focus on one end of the problem. I hate to be that guy, but as somebody that have you ever watched The Wire? Sure. I'm not going to cite The Wire as a real life example, but like obviously there's only so much you can do in a school when the children coming in are so beyond destroyed because of the family life and everything prior to them even getting to school that day. So I agree. Government is not like the solution to broken families. That would never be the case.
And it's actually not the solution to education, depending on the kind of solutions you're talking about. Some solutions, yes. Some solutions, no.
Yeah. So the only thing I'm looking at is, as I said earlier, just like these minimum threshold things where it's like, where can government make? Because you mentioned marginal, which I think is a really good way to look at it. It's like marginal costs and marginal utility to things, where the first $1,000 per student you spend might give you a huge return, but the extra $20,000 after.
Yeah, I think these are all pragmatic discussions.
Sure,
and actually, this is what we used to hash out in legislatures before they turned into platforms for people grandstanding. But yes,
sure. Okay, yeah.
As we descend from the heavens of philosophical discussion of conservatism and liberalism, let's go to the pragmatic muck of politics. Trump versus Biden. Between the two of them, who was, in their first term, the better president? And thus, who should win if the two of them are, in fact, our choices, should win the second term in 2024? Ben?
sure. So, in terms of actual job performance, you have to separate it into a few categories. In terms of actual performance in foreign policy, I think Trump's foreign policy record is significantly better than Biden's, the world being on fire right now, being a fairly good example of that. And we can get into each aspect of the world being on fire and where the incentive structures came from and how all of that happened in a moment. When it comes to the economy, I think that Trump's economic record was better than Biden's. Doesn't mean he didn't overspend. He did. He wildly overspent. But he also had a very solid record of job creation. A huge percentage of the gains in the economy went to people on the lower end of the economic spectrum. Actually, the gross income to the average American was about $6,000 during his term. The unemployment rates were very, very low before COVID. Yeah, I think that you almost have to separate the Trump administration as sort of before COVID and during COVID, because COVID obviously is sort of a black swan event, the most signal change in politics in our lifetime. And so, the governance during COVID is almost its own category, which we can discuss. But in terms of foreign policy, in terms of domestic policy, I think that Trump is significantly better than Biden has been, and that's on the upside for Trump. On the downside for Biden, obviously you're talking 4-year highs in inflation, you're talking about savings being eaten away, you're talking about everything being 20 to 30% more expensive. You're talking about massive increases to the deficit, even at a rate that was unknown under Trump. The deficit under Trump raised by about a little under $1 trillion every year up until 2020. Again, 2020 was COVID year, so everybody decided that we're going to fire hose money at things. But then Joe Biden continued to fire hose money at things in 21, 22, and 23. That obviously is, in my opinion, bad economic policy. And then we get to the rhetoric, and it's the stuff that Donald Trump says. And as I've said before, my view is that on Donald Trump's epitaph, on his gravestone, it will say Donald Trump. He's had a lot of shit. I think that Donald Trump does say a lot of things. I think that that is basically baked into the cake, which is why everyone who's bewildered by the polls is ignoring human nature, which is, at the beginning, when you see something very shocking, it's very shocking, and then if you see it over and over and over and over for years on end, it is no longer shocking. It's just part of the background noise, like tinnitus. It just becomes something that your brain adjusts for. And so, do I like a lot of Donald Trump's rhetoric? No, and I never have. Do I think that that is dispositive as to his presidency? No, I do not. When it comes to Biden, again, I think he's underperforming economically. I think his foreign policy has been really a problem. Even the things I think he's done right are, I think, band-aids for things that he created by doing wrong. And when it comes to his own rhetoric, you can argue that it's grading on a curve, because Trump was coming in with such wild rhetoric that just the maintenance of that wild rhetoric doesn't really change, again, the baseline. For Biden, he came in in the same way that Obama did, on the sort of soaring rhetoric of American unity and the president for all. Trump came in and he's like, listen, I'm the president for what I am, and I'm going to say the things I want to say. I'm going to be on the toilet, I'm tweeting. We're like, okay, so that's what it is. With Biden, he came in with, I'm the president for all Americans. I'm trying to unify everybody, and that pretty quickly broke down into a lot of oppositional language about his political opponents in particular, and attempt to lump in, for example, huge swaths of the conservative movement with the people who participated, for example, in January 6th, or who were fans of January 6th, the sort of lumping in of everybody into MAGA Republicans who wasn't personally signed on to an infrastructure bill with him. And that sort of stuff, I think, has been truly terrible. I thought his Philadelphia speech was truly terrible. And again, I think that you do have the problem of he is no longer capable of, certainly rhetorically, unifying the country when every speech from him feels like watching Nick Walenda walk across a volcano on a tightrope. It really is like you're just sort of waiting for him to fall. I mean, it's sad to say. I mean, the other day he was speaking for what was, in effect, his campaign kickoff. And this is in Valley Forge. And I mean, Jill rushed up there, like, as soon as he was done, Jill rushed up there, like she'd been shot out of the cannon to come and try and guide him away so he didn't become the Shane Gillis Roomba. And, that's not really, let's put it this way, it does not quiet the soul to watch Joe Biden rhetorically. Again, that's a different problem than Trump's problem, but that's my analysis.
This is one of the areas where we get into this. I don't understand if there's like brain breaking happening or what's going on. I don't know what world we can ever live in where we say that Trump is less divisive for the country than Biden. I think it is so patently obvious. Trump is so divisive. Like, not only does Trump make an enemy out of every person in the opposition party, he makes an enemy out of his own party and every single person around him. Like, we all watched him bully, Jeff Sessions. We all watched him bully his own party on Twitter. We all watched, like, all of these people walk away from him. Even recently, I think the Secretary of Defense Esper and John Kelly, the Chief of Staff, were saying, I think Trump is a threat to democracy. You got all of his prior people that were around him, his close allies. You've got Bill Barr that won't co-sign a single thing that he says. You've got all these people that he used to work with that all say Trump is a horrible, evil person. He is ineffective as a leader. He doesn't accomplish anything, and he didn't. To say that Biden has failed at bipartisanship when we've got the CHIPS Act, we've got the IRA, we've got the ARP, we've got the bipartisan infrastructure bill, when we've got like all this major legislation that is working in this historically divided Congress, as opposed to Trump that tax cuts and deficit spending. I don't understand where we ever are in this world where Biden is somehow more divisive than Trump. Even the speeches that is bringing up, they always bring up. I remember that one. I think we might have even done it on our episode. The one speech that Biden gave, where at one point that like the background is red, and
Probably speech I referenced.
yeah, they're like, oh my God, it's over, this is the end. And then meanwhile, you got Donald Trump, coming into office saying things like, if you burn the flag, you should have your citizenship revoked. Or talking about DNC, that I'm going to investigate every single one of these media organizations for corruptness. I'm going to open the libel and defamation laws. I'm going to take all of these guys to court. You've got this weird Project 2025 stuff where, is it John Paschal, I think, is talking about, we're gonna investigate all of these people and we're gonna try to throw crimes on all these people. Trump is like the most divisive president I think we've ever had at least in my lifetime of being an American citizen. And the rhetoric from him is just, it's on a whole other level in terms of the demonization of political opponents. I mean, this is a guy that's known for giving his political opponents bad nicknames, right? Like, that's what Trump does. It's funny, but even as a resident of Florida, if Florida had another natural disaster, do you think Trump would withhold aid? Because you had, I think that was one of the few nice things that DeSantis actually said about Biden was that, like, hey, listen, when the buildings collapsed in, I think that was in Miami Beach, that, for the hurricane stuff, that Biden was there. He was saying, if you guys need aid, how many billions, you can have it. Meanwhile, Trump, I think, was threatening to withhold federal funding from blue states that wouldn't, I think it had to do with the National Guard stuff, the Department of the National Guard, that they weren't, like, doing enough for the riots, and Trump was threatening to withhold aid from some of these blue states. Trump is literally the most divisive person in the world. I don't see how on any metric he is ever succeeding in the divisive category. In terms of the economy, I do think it's funny that Republicans are very keen to say that, like, well, we can't really grade Trump, post-COVID, because obviously COVID messed everything up, which is fair, but pre-COVID, what did Trump do? Yeah, he did deficit spending, tax cuts, he presided over historical interest rates, and an economy that was already like blazing